In Cuba's capital of Havana, the streets have been filled with demonstrators chanting slogans against the government. These protests, which began over economic hardships and government repression, have now evolved into a broader call for political reform. The people of Cuba are demanding change and they're not backing down.
It's extremely dangerous. If you were to look at what happened to the protesters on July 11th, 2021, there was extreme repression by the state and political prisoners, or what we call political prisoners of conscience. There are right now over 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba related to the July 11th, 2021 protests. But before July 11th, 2021, since Fidel Castro took power in 1959, we've had thousands of political prisoners. My father was one in the early 1960s. He was a young Afro-Cuban youth who was against the regime. Him and a couple of buddies ran a bus into the American embassy and they were put in prison. And he was repressed for many years until we were able to escape in the 1980s during the Mario boat lift. So Cuban people have been engaging, Cuban people across racial lines, because that's the other thing that people seem to forget, is that the Cuban regime is largely people who do not look like the Cuban people. The Cuban people are largely multiracial, of Afro-Cuban descent, and the people who are in power are not that. They're quite the color of the walls that you see behind me.
Well, they try and manage it behind the scenes without saying too much publicly, like most communist regimes do. I mean, Gil, ironically, was trying to bring in some private sector reforms to build up micro enterprises, which are pretty sparse in Cuba, and probably didn't go far enough with liberalisation. And of course, it comes to the difficulty we've now got with China, is that market liberalisation was meant to follow with some democratic liberalisation, and it looks like in Cuba that neither's happening. And so that's why people are desperately protesting. And when people leave, I mean, the Communist Party sees that as good, because they say there's less troublemakers around. You know, back when Jimmy Carter was president, he embraced all the Cubans trying to go over to the Keys and on whatever boat they could, and Fidel Castro opened up all the jails and the mental hospitals and let them all go, because he saw it as a chance to get rid of the troublemakers. So I think they'd rather more exodus than more protests at home.
The regime is shaking right now because the Cuban people since 2021 en masse, right? The 2021 July 11th protests were across the entire island, coming out of the poorest neighborhoods. People took to the streets, young people, college students took to the streets. College students, young people are still in prison. Women, mothers are still in prison because they exercised their human right. So the Cuban regime knows the Cuban people are getting smarter and they're not afraid. You know why they're not afraid? Because they're hungry, and the hunger is pushing them past their fear. So when you get the Cuban people to that point, the regime is of course terrified and they are on the brink of collapse. And so they want to keep blaming the embargo, which has not been an issue, right? Because the biggest exporter of meat and chicken has been the United States, right? And the embargo does not control food on the island. That's the Cuban regime's job. They control everything that doesn't come to the Cuban people. Even humanitarian aid, when it's allowed, it's controlled by the Cuban regime. So that has been that discourse that is also tied to these economic critiques, is the embargo. It's not the embargo, you know, and I think something like an analogy of an abusive husband, right? An abusive husband never thinks about the fact that they're an abuser. They're always blaming someone else. And that's exactly what the Cuban regime is doing now. But you know what? The Cuban people are rising up and they're standing against their abuser and they're calling it out. And the international community knows that, because this is a historic moment in Cuba.
In a bold move, Cuban artists and activists have united, urging the military to stand with the people. The collective effort seeks to amplify voices for change amid ongoing socio-political tensions. Their message underscores the call for solidarity and unity in the pursuit of a better future for Cuba.
It's extremely significant. One, let me just speak about celebrities. So the Cuban people have been engaging in these anti-government protests and pro-artist protests. So in 2019, the San Isidro artists, Michael Osorbo, Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara, who are now in prison, have been pushing the regime and pushing the state to allow artists more freedoms. And so again, even before 2021, the San Isidro movement has been popular in rising up against the regime and being a symbol of freedom through also the protest called Patria y Vida, which Afro-Cuban artists have also been leading with San Isidro. And so that is another piece when it comes to celebrities who have been leading that. But as far as the celebrities that have been engaging in talking specifically to the military, the strategy is that the military class and those under the military class are actually like the policemen, like those who are on the streets, are similar to the Cuban people, right? So they have maybe a little more privilege as far as maybe getting access to a little bit more food or a little bit more electricity than the actual Cuban people who are not a part of the state apparatus. So the celebrities are targeting them because they're not that much different than the Cuban people. And if they were to stop taking orders from the higher up military regime and actually side with the Cuban people, their brothers and sisters, the regime would fall. And that's the strategy with the celebrities.